participants. A new chapter of our roadmap towards COP26 is commencing today, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our first biodiversity-focused event on the road to COP26. Today, we are launching our three-part World Biodiversity series, starting at Climate Week New York City today, traveling to Kunming in October, and landing on November 10th in Glasgow during COP26. There is no questioning the current detrimental state of our planet, with the unprecedented losses in biodiversity leading to devastating natural disasters, deforestation, and the current COVID-19 pandemic as just a mere few examples of some of the ecological, economic, and social consequences of biodiversity loss. The link to climate change is so clear. Climate change and biodiversity loss are drivers of one another, and we simply cannot address one without addressing the other. And because we are part of nature, and what we keep doing to the planet, we keep doing to ourselves. We have to come together and partner to develop the policies, operate our economic and social systems and businesses in favor of the planet. It cannot be emphasized enough. We need the public and private sectors to further work together and collaborate to bring about the large-scale change required to meet the Paris Agreement goals. That is why the inaugural World Biodiversity Summit series starting today is well placed under the overarching theme of bridging biodiversity and climate from partnerships to action. By convening leaders from governments, businesses, international organizations, and civil society, we provide a dedicated platform to address the interlinked emergencies. We promote multi-sectoral, decisive, and collaborative action to increase the value of mitigation strategies and scale promising solutions. And we know how to do this. World Climate Foundation has cultivated over 10 years of experience in the climate field. Through its collaborative high-level network, World Climate Foundation identifies and accelerates cross-sector implementation of markets, technologies, and policies at the required scale to realize change. And we are now bringing this extensive experience into the crucial area of biodiversity loss and its imminent restoration. Today is the first in a series of 3 events, and I would first like to thank our sponsors, our partners, and Climate Week New York City for making this possible. As our launching topic, we chose food systems and agriculture because currently these systems are undeniable primary drivers of biodiversity loss. We will hear today from leading experts on nature-based solutions, finance, and regenerative agriculture. And make sure to stick around after the panel discussion. You'll have the opportunity to ask your questions to the speaker through an engaging Q&A session. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Zitouni Uldada, Deputy Director at FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Environment. Dr. Uldada, thank you for being here. I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Zina, and welcome everyone to this part 1 of the World Biodiversity Summit organized by the World Climate Foundation. It's my pleasure to moderate this event, and we're inaugurating the summit today with this event on nature-based solutions, finance and regenerative agriculture. How can we stimulate resilient food production and security? As you said, Zina, biodiversity and climate change are 2 interconnected crises, and we have to address them together. It makes sense. Climate change and biodiversity loss are happening also everywhere around us and at the same time. And they both threaten all our lives, our livelihoods, and the life of the planet. So we need to join the dots and advance progress together as we work to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, the post-2020 Global Framework for Biodiversity, and the SDGs. And it's crucial that we do this in a synergistic way. And the state of the natural environment is really directly linked to our ability to adapt, mitigate, and solve the challenges that our planet is facing, such as climate change and biodiversity loss. And this is why the World Biodiversity Summit offers this dedicated platform for effective and partnership-driven solutions to help achieve this. And the goal of this summit, as Zina said, is to bridge biodiversity and climate change, and to accelerate investment-driven solutions to the biodiversity crisis. So the summit will serve as a convening platform for all those concerned, not just leaders from across public and private sectors, but also any others, including from civil society, and all of us citizens are also concerned, to set the world on a path to achieve the vision for biodiversity through actionable leadership and supporting the facilitation of a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. So the summit will be organized in 3 parts. Today is part 1, which is organized in the margins of the New York City Climate Week, and also the UN Food System Summit that is happening today. And part 2 will be on the 14th of October at COP15 on biodiversity in Kunming in China. And the last part 3, will be on the 10th of November at COP26 on climate change in Glasgow in the UK. So this part 1 is very timely and relevant because it coincides with the UN Food System Summit that is being held today during the UN General Assembly in New York. And it is setting the stage for a global transformation of agri-food systems by identifying game-changing solutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, particularly SDG 2 to achieve zero hunger. So our event today focuses on nature-based solutions, finance, regenerative agriculture. How can we stimulate resilient food production and security? And I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists today. Emma Shaw, who is the lead of Food Initiative at Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Martin Coherin, who is the Senior Manager for Sustainability, Climate Change and Natural Resources at the Economist Impact. Hans Soter, Corporate Sustainability Officer at Fresh Del Monte. And Jose Pugas, who's a partner and head of ESG and agribusiness at JGP Credito from Brazil. So thank you all for joining us. Just before we kick off our dialogue and discussion, let me again welcome everyone who is joining us. And just to remind you that you have the chat box option there, and we would very much welcome your questions, your thoughts, anything you would like to share with us for this topic. They will be very welcome. But particularly any questions, either you want to direct them to any of the speakers or in general, we would welcome that, and I'll do my best to ask them to our panelists today. So I hope that set the scene and explains the purpose of this event. And I'm very pleased again to welcome all our panelists. And let me start with asking each one of you a question to give you a chance to introduce yourself and also to say what your organization is doing on this space. Let me start with Emma. And Emma, if you could please tell us, what is your organization doing in stimulating resilient food production and security? For 3 minutes each, please. Over to you, Emma.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me as part of today's discussion. For those who have never heard of the Ellen McCarthy Foundation, we are a global charity that is working on our mission to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. And you may have heard those words, circular economy or circularity, in the past, and maybe it's brand new. So if it's new, you can really look at it or boil it down to 3 words: eliminate, circulate, and regenerate. So it's a framework about eliminating waste and pollution, It's about circulating materials and products at their highest use for as long as possible in the economy. And most importantly, regenerating nature, which is specifically relevant. Well, all of them are, but especially relevant to food, since it's something that we're actually consuming and you can't just keep in use forever, like a phone or other technical materials. So we've been working on food through the Food Initiative, which I lead with a global team over the past few years. And it's about applying these principles to fundamentally reimagine the food system, to rather than trying to undo the damage of today's linear take, make, waste, highly damaging, degrading, bad for people, bad for business, bad for nature system. We can actually have absolute good, because food is part of nature, which is inherently regenerative. So we can actually be growing food and eating, enjoying food in a way that helps to build biodiversity, helps to tackle climate change, and reverse the role of the food system today from being the primary driver of biodiversity loss and a contributor of 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions to a fundamental, critical part of the solution. And just earlier this week, on Tuesday, we launched a new report called The Big Food Redesign: Regenerating Nature with the Circular Economy. And it's laying out the opportunity specifically for food manufacturers and retailers to rethink their portfolios and use the power of design to make the economics work and create a more resilient, regenerative system. So I'm looking forward to hopefully feeding in some of the findings and what we've learned through the past 9 months of research in today's conversation.
Thanks very much, Emma. We very much look forward to that. And thanks for highlighting the importance of circularity of material and products, as you said, to regenerate nature, and applying these principles for systems and agri-food systems transformation. Thank you for that. Martin?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Situni, and thanks a lot to all of the organizers of the World Biodiversity Summit and New York City Climate Week. And it's great to be here with you. And so what we do at Economist Impact, and just by way of introduction, so Economist Impact is part of the Economist Group that also produced the Economist newspaper. We provide insight, innovation, and influence, bringing partners together to pursue progress around the world. And what we have done over many years now, and very excited also that we did another iteration this year. We have produced the Food Sustainability Index, which measures the sustainability of food systems in 78 countries now. We've expanded the index across the 3 key issues that are outlined in the 2015 BCFN Milan Protocol. So we have done this together at Economist Impact with the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition since 2016. And so what we have done in this year, we have the broadest coverage yet with our 78 countries. We're covering 92% of GDP and 92% of the global population. And what we really want to do with this index, and it includes 38 indicators on food system sustainability and 95 sub-indicators, is really to address the societal, environmental, and economic dimensions of food systems. And it's all available for free at foodsustainability.eiu.com. And there are 3 pillars there, and they're all linked, of course, to biodiversity and climate. And as the introduction by Zaina said, we have to look at these issues combined and kind of reinforcing processes that are happening there. So the 3 pillars of our index are, first of all, food loss and waste. We want to highlight, what kind of food loss is happening at the retailer, but also in terms of the food loss that is happening at the the post-harvest levels, and also, of course, the food waste at the end user level. And of course, sustainable agriculture is all about that's the second pillar, all about looking at the different ecosystems we have, like water systems, land. We look at biodiversity as a crucial part of that sustainable agriculture pillar, alongside land use and human capital, and also air, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, the third pillar, nutritional challenges, which is looking at the life quality, life expectancy, dietary patterns. And why we have chosen these 3 pillars. So first of all, of course, we have food loss and waste. Almost 1 billion people suffer from hunger around the world, but 1/3 of all food produced is lost or wasted. 1/3. That's a huge waste of resources. And of course, food loss and waste is rapidly moving up the policy agenda, and is linked, of course, to biodiversity, because if we look at, and of course, the regenerative agriculture is an important topic of today's session, because, if we were to recycle farm waste, for example, as much as possible, or adding composted materials from different sources, also from outside the farm, then we could really reduce the burden of food loss and waste, and thereby also help with regenerative agriculture. And of course, sustainable agriculture is also really important because the world is running out of cultivatable land. I mean, more sustainable farming techniques are needed, so we're looking at that in our index. And finally, of course, nutritional challenges. And as you know, we have this double burden, with overweight and obesity being on the rise, but we also have food security still being an issue for many. And that's, of course, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequence on public health and the economy. So what we did this year, we added a lot of indicators to make sure that the index captures these interrelated issues. We looked at the resilience of food systems. We looked at the One Health approach. We're looking at food availability and affordability, which is crucial. And of course, the planetary health diet and other healthy diets that are also good for the planet. We analyze food-based dietary guidelines. We look at climate change mitigation and adaptation. We also look at gender equality, of course, and animal welfare. So we already published the G20 paper that focuses on the G20 countries. And at the end of November, we're going to release the full index with the 78 countries. And it's really important to look at all these issues across food systems, to learn from the best examples, best practice examples in different countries, and to consider where are countries falling short, and where are they formulating policies that are good examples for other countries. So very excited that the Food Sustainability Index hopefully can be part of the solution and can be part of the discussion of how we bring biodiversity and climate into the discussion at the World Biodiversity Summit.
Thanks very much, Martin. You brought a lot to the discussion. There is so much there, and I'm sure hopefully we'll generate some discussions or comments from people following us. And I will come back to you some points you raised there. The Food Sustainability Index and its application, and the three pillars you mentioned on food loss and waste, sustainable agriculture and nutrition, absolutely key really. And I'm glad you mentioned the contrast between obesity and hunger, because today we have around 811 million people who go hungry every day. And on the other hand, we have 2 billion people who are obese or overweight. And as you said, in addition to that, 1/3 we produce for human consumption, 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption is wasted. So it doesn't really make any sense. Thanks very much for highlighting that. Hans?
Thank you, Situni, and thank you, World Biodiversity Summit. It's an honor for me to be representing the farming community, and which should be very much part of this conversation. Definitely, food systems is all about farming, and we need more participation from the agricultural sector. We at Fresh Del Monte have made sustainability a strategic goal for several years already, and are very proud to have been working on a system where biodiversity and agricultural production can coexist. And let me stress this again, biodiversity needs space to prosper. And that's what we have been doing at Fresh Del Monte. We have set aside 28% of our own land to either preserve or reforest vital forests that are necessary for biodiversity. At the same time, using cutting-edge technology to be able to maintain our yields, to be able to feed a ever-growing global population. Now, this cannot be this needs to be a team effort. Different stakeholders in society need to participate, both retailers, consumers, policymakers, environmental organizations, and researchers. Very important, researchers at public and universities and private business need to collaborate to come up to sustain the generation of technology for sustainable farming. We cannot address this key issue of our times with dogmas. In the same way that life sciences and digital technology have positively helped society address the current pandemic, where we are having this conference digitally, and people are being vaccinated. In the same way, we need to allow science and technology to support the efforts to bring in sustainable agriculture and the incentives for farmers to adopt them quickly.
Thanks very much, Hans. We added a new dimension really to what's been said so far, and particularly since you represent the farming community, the need to involve farmers in what we're talking about is absolutely critical. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of cutting-edge technology and innovation. It's so critical if you want to transform the agri-food systems to make them more efficient, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. So I'm sure, again, hopefully we'll come back to the points you raised on that. Thanks a lot. Jose?
Thank you, Dr. Zitouni. I would like to thank you to the World Biodiversity Summit for the opportunity to share some of our experiences. We are very proud to be representing the financial sector, even more because we are from Brazil. There's a very focus on agriculture, but it's not a financial center of the world. So it's a pleasure to be with you, sharing some of what we are doing. And mostly because we start a new obsession at JGP. We are obsessed with regenerative and low carbon agriculture, and this obsession has a very recent history. When we decided to sign the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative, we have accepted the challenge to be carbon neutral by 2040. And it's not an easy challenge to be overcome. We're talking about more than $5 billion portfolio in assets under management and site that we have here at JGP. But in order to achieve this goal, we had to engage with industries and sectors that were not that could have the best carbon results, and preferably not sectors that were satisfied to be carbon neutral, but they eager to be nature positive, to have better results on carbon, to be better than just carbon neutral. And with this goal, the obvious choice was the agribusiness sector, mostly on the food production sector. And luckily, we are in Brazil. So when we have 20% of all our GDP based on the agribusiness sector. And when you look at that, the size of opportunity, we also see the size of the challenge. How could we transform a sector that generates $300 billion every year, 20% of all the GDP of our country, in the epicenter of the green transition, of the green transformation? And for complex questions, we like to have simple answers. And the answer was transforming supply chains into a more effective powerhouses to transform the farming methods and to foster the green transition. And how we could do that, how JGP could join this revolution, doing what we do the best, providing credit. So we decided to start a green credit revolution in the farming sector in Brazil. So we started at the beginning of this year providing and creating new financial mechanisms that were directed for regenerative agriculture, that we call Regenerative Finances Platform here at JGP, concerning the very peculiarities of the Brazilian agribusiness sector and Brazilian credit scenario that is very different from European scenario. We lack long-term credits in Brazil, long-term with grace periods that are adequate to the financial transition, as well that the average credit that's provided to Brazilian agriculture is not tied to environmental performance of the borrowers. So they don't have any kind of competitiveness against the traditional credit, how we could improve the competitiveness of regenerative agriculture through credit. So here at JGP, we have been very focused on planting and supply chain finance with planted finance through sustainability linked loans and mechanisms to achieve the largest basis of farmers that we could. And that's how we aim that till the end of next year to impact more than 300,000 hectares of land in Brazil, converting them to regenerative and low carbon agriculture and impacting more than 1,000 producers, 1,000 farmers on the most sensitive biomes in Brazil. That's our goal and that's our purpose. And I hope to share with you some of those experiences and how we plan to do it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jose. Thanks for bringing the perspective of the private and financial sector, particularly the focus you have on regenerative and low carbon agriculture, and all the challenges and opportunities that you mentioned as well to transform the agri-food systems and to invest in them towards a green transition. So thanks very much for adding that element as well. Before we continue, the various colleagues watching us are asking to post in information, links to the things you mentioned, and I can see some of them have gone. So please keep doing that. If you mention any paper, any report, any study you would like to share with our viewers, that would be welcome. And the same for the audience following us. So please post in any questions, any comments, any things you want to share with us as well, and help us have this dialogue as interactive and lively as possible. So let me go back to Emma for some questions. Emma, the whole transformation of food systems really requires us to rethink how we produce and how we consume food. So how do we make food systems really nature positive?
So about a year ago, we had this hypothesis that industry has a really big role to play in terms of industry who represent food buyers, because you've heard some great comments around where we need to move at the land level towards nature positive regenerative systems. And at the end of the day, that's working and supporting farmers to go through that transition to really be the biggest climate champions and biodiversity builders that we can have out there, which is really inspiring, gives me hope. But the question is, how do you accelerate and how do we get to that potential future, which we know is possible, as fast as possible? And that's where we need to make the economics work. I know we're discussing a lot around financing the transition today, but that needs to be teamed as well with making the economics and the actual markets for these material streams work, and not just relying on policy and finance coming from different means. So when we look at the food buyers, what we see is actually, we did some analysis in the EU and UK, and we found that about 40% of the agricultural land is supplying ingredients to the top 10 food manufacturers and retailers. So they have a huge agricultural footprint, a relatively small group of players. You can say if they move very quickly in a direction and set the trend for the rest of industry to follow, we can do things in a really big scaled, positive, impactful way. How can they do that? It's about rethinking what ingredients they're using and how those ingredients are produced, and using the power of design. We don't tend to talk about food being designed. We talk about our clothes being designed. That's common understanding. But just like our clothes, so much of the food we eat is designed, because these food manufacturers and the retailers, the supermarkets, right? The choices that they make, those design decisions, determine the look of the food, the taste of the food, the nutrition it contains, the price, how good it is for us, and how good it is for nature. And so right now, all of these businesses are designing, whether they call it that or not. But we're not harnessing the power of design to maximize the positive impacts it can have for the customers, so we can create products and offerings that are better for customers, that are better for farmers, and that are better for climate as well. And what we lay out in the Big Food Redesign, which I was mentioning earlier, is essentially a framework and approach for industry to take on, to start to take these steps and actually use ingredients that are diverse. Right now, 4 crops are satisfying about 60% of the world's calories. That is not a resilient system. We are in such a vulnerable food production system today, and it's not benefiting nutrition either. So we need to and can tap into the wealth of that. There's hundreds of thousands of edible species out there, and we need to diversify, and that fits perfectly with regenerative systems, which entail diversity of crops. You go from monocropping systems to integrated mixed cropping systems and integration of livestock, saying, what does this place need to be regenerated? And therefore, what do I plant here? What livestock do I integrate? And so we need to take a mindset shift and a new goal that we're designing for, which is not what food do I want and then how do I grow that in the most regenerative way, but saying, what does nature provide in this regenerative system, and how do I design my products and offerings to help nature thrive? And that's really a fundamental shift from where we are today. And we see a lot of great energy and momentum, I at least sense, across industry, but also in, of course, in farming realms and policymakers and beyond, around regenerative production, which is good. We need that, but we need to make sure that we have the right angle in mind. And it's not just about optimizing and using regenerative production practices or methods rather with the few crops that we're producing today. Because while that can make us, we can get benefits from where we are today, which is a really negative state, that's not going to get us to the North Star. So we really need to add that team, the selection of ingredients with the methods of production.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. I like the point you made about redesigning food. And it's true, you draw the parallel with redesigning our clothes, and we do care about clothes and what we look like. And in general, we don't seem to care in the same way about food. So if we can actually value food even more, through what you said, and also the fact that we need to diversify, we need to be focusing on just very limited, as you said, 4 crops that provide 60% of the world's calories, and yet there is a diversity of food out there to benefit from and to provide nutritious food to everyone. So thanks very much. And this brings me to the point about redesigning and rethinking can only succeed also if we deal with the food loss and waste and then the food and that we're throwing away. So that brings me nicely to Martin, because in the pillars you mentioned earlier, the 3 pillars, one of them was food loss and waste. And you mentioned that it is one of the indicators of what's not working in the agri-food systems. So it'd be grateful if you could share with us some of the food waste solving initiatives and solutions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Zitouni. It's a great point. And also, Emma, I completely agree. And I think there are some of the things you said really resonate also in the food loss and waste space. I mean, you mentioned, making economics and markets work, which is really important for food loss and waste as well, in addition to policy, of course. And as you said, Zitouni, the value of food is crucial. And if we waste 1/3 of food that we produce, I mean, we are clearly not valuing food as much as we should. So it's also really important for regenerative agriculture, which is, obviously one of the themes of today, which is, it's really crucial to think about how much land could be diverted to regeneration if less food was wasted or lost. And if we look at the food sustainability index that we produce, so the vast majority of the countries we look at are addressing food loss and waste, which is good. I mean, they look at this in their national strategies, for example. The majority of countries have targets on food loss and waste in place, which is great. But measuring is really hard, and more needs to be done by countries to report the levels of food loss and waste. I mean, UNEP, for example, has done a great job in adding data on that, compiling data, but clearly at the national level, there needs to be more done in terms of measuring food loss and waste more accurately. Across the G20 countries that we looked at, there are private institutions dealing with food waste, for example. There are lots of academic institutions now that are starting to carry out research on food waste. And I think, earlier it was mentioned, one of the other panelists, how important it is to have research and science as part of this solution. Only half of the G20 countries have the right food waste legislation in place, though. And that's why it's important, actually, also to look at policy in addition to economics and markets. So, for example, the countries that are doing well on food loss and waste, Canada, Italy, Germany, Japan, and the US, for example, are among those countries. The driver for them is strong performance that looks at legislation. I mean, the levels of food loss and waste measured varies, and all of those 5 countries, they demonstrate a strong policy response. So the policy is important. And what is important is that they have national legislation in place to reduce food waste. It starts with that legislation, and then markets and the economics can adjust to that and adapt to that. The countries that are not doing well on food loss and waste, they're performing poorly because they have high levels of food loss and waste. And why they address food loss at some extent, there's very little evidence that they have these kind of policies in place. And what are these kind of policies? So there is a target, measure, act approach, which works and has been proven to work in food loss and waste, which is about, a country or a company that set a target for the amount by which it wants to reduce its loss and waste. It starts with that target, but then it also measures the situation along its supply chain. It's really important, the supply chain approach, measuring accurately, and then taking action to make reductions. So target, measure, act. And we can see some countries and institutions are starting to do that, to really start assessing the data and monitoring the progress so far. For example, the EU, the member states have started to begin reporting their levels of food waste, and they have to do that by mid-2022. In 2016, the EU launched the EU platform on food loss and waste, for example. In 2019, it established a common methodology to measure food loss and waste in the bloc. So it's really important to have these kind of measures in place. And then, they're working on these, guidelines on food donations. And I think they added these in 2020. So there are examples of target, measure, act, and practice. There is, of course, across the G20 countries, the so-called Good Samaritan laws, and they're all about encouraging retailers, and most obviously, of course, supermarkets, to donate excess or unsold food to charity. So those kind of initiatives exist. And the private sector, it's really crucial. What we see in the private sector is Champions 12.3, which is a coalition by retailers that have come together, and the 10 times 20 times 30 initiative, which brings together at least 10 of the world's largest food retailers and providers, each engaging at least 20% of their suppliers to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030. So far, around 200 suppliers have been recruited. So there are these initiatives by the private sector as well. And of course, we look at the countries that are performing best in our food sustainability index: Canada, Japan, Australia, Germany, and France. They combine strong outputs with robust policy response across the three pillars. And of course, I wanted to highlight just two countries that are not among those top 5, but they have really interesting initiatives in place. For example, the UK is among the G20 countries that has become kind of a poster child for food loss and waste reduction, because what they have done is they recorded a reduction of food loss of 27% in 2018 relative to its baseline in 2007. The UK, what they have done is they have done what I mentioned earlier with the Target, Measure, Act. So they have been able to measure their reduction in waste effectively, because they have funded a domestic NGO, the RAP, Waste and Resources Action Program, and they have established a way to measure loss and food loss accurately. The scheme helps to firms reduce supply chain waste, for example. A public information campaign has been rolled out, the Love Food, Hate Waste campaign, and retailers and manufacturers are improving packaging design as well. And then finally, China as well. In April 2021, they passed their comprehensive anti-food waste law. They're doing it quite differently. They don't have this Good Samaritan policy. Instead, they're going with legislation. So what they're doing is they're addressing food waste at the food service and household level. So it's quite a different approach that's seen elsewhere. So what they're doing, they're fining food service providers that encourage consumers to order excessive food. And so there are different approaches around that work.
Great, thanks. You mentioned a number of things around the need for policy and legislation. And Emma earlier was talking about the importance to change mindset. So I would like to go back to Emma later on, because what you said about policy and legislation absolutely is happening in so many countries. But how do we get people to stop throwing food away? So I would like to go back to Emma afterward, just in terms of mindset. How do we influence people so they can see the value of food, not to throw it away? Because when we throw food away, we don't just throw the food, we throw the energy, the nutrients, the water, everything that goes with it. And that brings me nicely to the importance of soil and soil protection, because we use the soil to grow food, obviously. And if we don't grow the food in a sustainable and efficient way, so the quality of soil obviously will be degrading with time. And we know that the health of soil is critical, because it stores large quantities of carbon. And soil also has a positive role for climate change, biodiversity, adaptation and mitigation, production of food, obviously, and food security at large. So let me bring in Hans now. And Hans, if you could share with us from your perspective, your thought about soil health as one of the key nature-based solutions that we're talking about.
Thank you, Situni. Definitely, soil is a critical component of food production systems. As you said before, water, climate, and the crop varieties, diversity of crop varieties that are resilient. But soil is at the base of it all. If we lose the productive potential of our soils, we are bound to continue encroaching into forests and continue impacting biodiversity. So keeping the productive potential of soils is at the base of it all. And we at Fresh Del Monte believe, take a scientific approach to it. We have for many years used the voluntary guidelines for soil sustainable management from FAO. And have elevated now this year our goals to implement regenerative and soil health management practices in 100% of our own and partner grower operations by 2030. It's a huge goal. It's a global goal, and it's going to involve engaging growers and other players. And we hope to influence the industry in so doing. It has many components to it. As you can go to our CSR report, or you can go to FAO's voluntary guidelines for sustainable soil management. But it's all about preventing erosion, preventing salinization of our soils, preventing compaction of the soils, preventing pest and pathogen infestation of these soils, and keeping nutrient balance and enhancing organic matter content of these soils. And how you'd go about it, it's another whole conversation, but we are set to do it and very optimistic about the change that this will bring in the industry.
Great. Thank you, Hans. And I'm pleased, obviously, that you mentioned the FAO voluntary guidelines for sustainable soil management and their relevance for regenerative agriculture and the importance of soil. It's a big topic, obviously, but it is a key part of the nature-based solutions that we're talking about. And it is also linked to investment in the future, in looking at conserving biodiversity in addition to just growing food. And obviously, innovation comes to play when we talk about the future of food and thinking about feeding a growing population. So technological advances in the agri-food systems are increasing and are linked to the financial mechanism that you mentioned, Jose, earlier. So I just want to ask you, how has innovation and precision agriculture been incorporated into the financial mechanisms you mentioned earlier for the transition to more resilient food systems?
Dr. Situni, from a financial perspective, when we design a financial facility to foster the transition to green economy and base it on sustainability and regenerative agriculture, we must be aware that we will need to monitor the results, the impacts, and not only environmental but also social impacts and externalities of this investment. So in Brazil, not only Brazil, but all across the globe, most agribusiness companies believe that traceability is enough. It's not enough. Uh, just to monitor the product traceability is no longer an adequate technology to understand the true impact of the food chain, of the food production. We have to go much forward than just ledgering the movements of a material from point A to point B. We have to understand the impact and externalities of each stage of this production, from the genetics, from the inputs that are going to be used in the farming, and after farming, all the way up to the post-consumption. It's not just a question of knowing the way, the trajectory of the product, but know what has been left behind in this production chain. So nowadays we have technology to monitor that. We are talking about satellite monitoring. We are talking about a lot of new technologies of IoT, ground sensors, and other technologies that can and have to be used to monitor those externalities. And of course, to be placed as an overlay on the traceability technologies. We're not saying that traceability has not to be kept, but we have to evolve the traceability technologies with those new technologies. So as well, that nowadays most of the certification methods are based on field audit. They are in countries such like ours, they're continental. We have with a lot of logistical complexities, is not only ineffective but also expensive. So we have to make a hybrid approach between field audits and technological use. We have the ability to monitor farms and all the supply chain in real time. Why have to wait field audits that happen once a year? It's not effective. It's not smart. So we have to use it even more technology to understand how to help the farmer, not to punish the farmer, but to help him to understand the use of technology and the use of data that is provided by this technology. For example, we have a huge climate risk on agribusiness sector. Anyone that has read the IPCC report may have discovered something that for the agribusiness sector, for the farmer, is known for a long time. The climate has changed, and is charging a fee over the production of the crops. So when we start to collect data from smart weather systems to understand how those climate risks are applied to the farmers, for the financial industry, it's a kind of data that allow us to better understand the risks and to have better, more competitive credit products and financial products to help the farmer to transition and to be more resilient to these climate changes. And that's something that for us at the financial industry, we are based on data to make our decisions, is something that is decisive. And when we look at the other technologies, such as the credit score, there are many nowadays that are based on artificial intelligence. Most of them just ignore ESG factors. They must be incorporated in those technologies. We have to understand the ESG rating of the farms, because no longer a question of what you produce, is a question of how you produce, where you produce. That's something that we have to develop, and the only way to do it is through technology.
Great, thanks very much, Jose. And then I'll pick up on the key points you made, that we want to help farmers. We're talking about nature-based solutions. The solutions have to benefit farmers and us as consumers. And to use data and innovation to help achieve that, I think that's not just increasing significantly, but it's the future we go towards. We have to harness the power of innovation and the power of nature as well, by regeneration, as it was said. So thanks for that. Let me now go back to the question I parked earlier when Martin spoke about food loss and waste. And I want to go back to Emma. Perhaps Emma and Martin, you could comment on this. Food loss and waste, the food that we keep throwing away. So Martin talks about policy and regulation. Absolutely, that's needed. But for consumers, how do we influence or help people to understand that it costs a lot to throw food away? Let me start with you, Emma.
So I must say that some organizations that Martin mentioned, like WRAP here in the UK, have done much more work on this consumer informing and influencing and education angle than we have. But we tend to focus on the system. How do you make the system designed in a way so that the concept of waste is just eliminated altogether? And I think that does cross both realms in terms of civil society and also industry too. How do we shift the narrative? Because as long as we keep talking about waste, we're reinforcing that is a thing and that exists in the system. And I think there's a couple elements here. One is in terms of rewiring the relationship that we have with food as eaters to properly value it. There's an information gap right now, and especially as there's growing urban populations, and most people will think that all their food just comes from the market or from the retailer, when actually it's coming from the farm. And so it's much easier to undervalue it when you don't know the people and the places and everything that went into it. So one thing that I'm interested in, and also how do you harness digital as well in an era where e-commerce, exacerbated with COVID too, is accelerating. How do you share those stories in accessible ways so that you know the farmer behind the food that you're enjoying and the effort they put in? And then the other point just to highlight is, I think it's really important when we look at the issue of food waste is, in today's highly degrading system, food waste is so bad from an impacts on nature and climate perspective because of how it's produced, right? And so we can't just focus at the end of pipe trying to deal with the symptoms of what's an underlying linear system. And actually, we need to go upstream to everything Jose was talking about at the farm level to move towards regenerative. Because if you get to that, this is a hyper idyllic state, right? But to a state where actually all the food that's being produced is having positive impacts, just absolutely, not even negative, net positive, like just absolute positive impacts, then food that goes uneaten is actually part of a regenerative system. Just like in nature, excess apples on an apple tree that don't get picked, though in a regenerative system, they go back into the soil and they become food for the insects and the microbes, and they enrich the soil for more life to come out of it. So we take those principles and everything that we can learn from the wisdom and elegance of nature and say, how do we design the infrastructure and systems to allow that as well, right? So I think making sure whenever we talk about waste, we don't just look at it through an isolated tunnel vision, but understand why it has the impacts that it does today and what is the North Star, and have a full system view, which is challenging because of the complexity of food, but we have to, otherwise we can be short-sighted or misallocate energy and resources and develop disjointed strategies. And one final point is, when we talk about food waste and loss, we often are just thinking about the parts of food that we can eat immediately, and coming back to the how do we design a resilient food system is one that's making the most of what we're growing today. And actually we can harness the power of innovations that are emerging to take parts of food that we can't immediately eat. So like the 2.8 billion tons of agricultural residues, some of that can actually be transformed into ingredients, for instance, that can provide the property of sweetness, and therefore reduce demand on what I'll call like virgin soil to grow things like sugarcane and sugar beets and corn, where we get most of our sweetener from today. So we call that upcycling in industry. And so thinking not just about the edible fraction, but inedible as well.
Right. Great. Thanks, Emma. You just made me think, today when I was having lunch, I was having potatoes with chicken. And then I was thinking, I've been in cultures where you can't eat potatoes with the skin, and in others where it's perfectly acceptable and part of the culture to have the potatoes with the skin. And I'm just thinking, why in some parts of the world actually we throw the skin away and it becomes waste, of course, and yet you can actually consume it. So this is really an interesting aspect of how do you actually either convince people or make them understand that there are some parts of the food that we shouldn't be throwing away. Perhaps we need to consider eating them as part of our diet. So it's a wider question, but you just made me think. It just thought came to my mind, honestly, when I was having lunch, thinking, that's interesting. But let's see what Martin thinks. What's your perspective, Martin?
Yes, it's funny, and that's a great point. And actually, you raised something really important, which is the cultural aspect of food. And when we did our study, we interviewed people from different contexts and so on. And I mean, one finding was that you have to take into account the cultural and religious context of food and food waste as well. I mean, for example, hospitality is such an important aspect in many cultures, being a good host. And that also means providing potentially, more food than is actually eaten because you want to be a good host. So changing mindsets and awareness towards reducing food loss and waste in that context can be challenging. And of course, I mean, I completely agree with Emma on that front, that the policy is only one aspect, and you have to look at the full system. Governments can set the tone, though, by introducing legislation that encourages retailers and ultimately also consumers to waste less food. And there are the approaches I mentioned in the UK with the focus on RAP, and China with focus on legislation. But then we have governments in France and the UK, for example, that look beyond those limits of legislation to work with all of the food system stakeholders, retailers and consumers. So for example, in France, there is an interesting initiative that is the Inglorious Fruits and Vegetables campaign, which is run by the French supermarket chain Intermarché. And so what they did is they actually kind of brought kind of ugly but still kind of perfectly edible foods. And ugly is always in the eye of the beholder anyway, but food that the majority of consumers might perceive as ugly but still perfectly tasty, and brought those to the supermarkets at discounted prices. And consumers see that these are actually, and these taste really, really nice. It doesn't really matter how it looks like. So that's one campaign. And then there's also other things. I mean, like the governments, US, Germany, Japan, for example, that we looked in our index. They included revisions to the labels on food packaging to kind of disincentivize consumers from throwing away food prematurely. So the labeling aspect is really important as a link between the governments, retailers, and consumers. The Turkish government, they collaborate with the FAO actually in 2020. You might be aware of this, Zitouni, as well. The Save Your Food campaign that they did. That helped to raise awareness of the difference between the sell-by and the best before date on food labels, because there's a crucial difference there. And then on a smaller scale, there are startups in the UK and the US, for example, that we looked at in our study that created apps, for example, that connect shops and restaurants with excess food, and then they provide them to charities and so on, and social organizations. That also is a way of dealing with this. And there even, their websites, there's even an entire supermarket that has been created to sell food that is beyond its best before date. So there are lots of interesting solutions to really connect this issue with people.
Well, thanks very much, Martin. There was a question from the audience on which says, are we funding the change for the farmer and underwriting the risk they have to take to adopt new approaches and solutions? So before I ask Jose perhaps to answer that, I'll come back to you, Hans. I'm just telling you the next question, Hans. If you want to add something or a comment on how we're leveraging science and technology to make food systems more resilient, since you mentioned the importance of science and technology earlier and the importance of collaboration. So I'll come back to you after Jose answers the questions on the funding, the change for the farmers. Jose?
Wonderful question. I truly believe that the real risk is not to fund the transition. There is no actual risk in transitioning. The risk is not to transition to this new way of producing. So yes, we are funding the farmers to make this transition. The risks are have to be faced because we have operational risks, of course, but we have so many good examples of regenerative agriculture that sustain high production levels with even less risk than the traditional production methods. That nowadays we see regenerative and low carbon agriculture as a as a de-risking of an operation, not a risking not a new risk or increasing risk of operation. But how to do that? First, planted finance. We need investors. We need the profile of investors that we don't find in Brazil, that accept long-term relationship with the credit, that accept crazy periods that fits to the new cash flow of the farms. In Brazil, most of the investors, they accept low risks, low term, small terms, and with conditions of payment they are not suitable to the regenerative agriculture. So we depend on planted finance, but of course there are plenty of concessional funds that we have to connect. I think there's just a question of connecting, of building bridges. Is not something that we need to create. We just need to join efforts of the many players that are already in the field of planted finance, and they are not acting in Brazil as they should be acting right now. And not only to planted finance, but we also have to understand there are new currencies in the capital market. Those new green currencies, or the carbon credit, biodiversity bonds, water bonds, the blue bonds as we call it. There are plenty of new currencies. So we have to introduce those currencies, to monetize those credits in order for the farmer to understand that they can use it to lower the interest rates, to decrease the real cost of a credit transaction. And for the investor must understand that those coins has values and they have to accept those values. We are in an operation right now with a major cooperative in Brazil that the investor, the concessional investor, is accepting the results in carbon credits. So there is a small return of investment in cash, and the minimum attractiveness rate of the investment is reconstituted by those new coins. Is something that we want to foster even more, not only in Brazil but abroad. That's how to rethink the financial model. We have to go through rethink what is called value, and the value has to be connected to biodiversity, has to be connected to natural capital, to soil regeneration, to better water usage, and to less waste, as we can see. So to bring value to those new objectives, to monetize those objectives, is to foster the transition to happen faster in a more fair way with the farmer.
Great, thanks very much, Jose. Hans, want to come in for the question on innovation?
Yeah, thank you so much, and definitely a good starting point after Emma's and Jose's points regarding diversity. Domestication of crops has been a very lengthy process for humanity, and new crops brought to the equation will take time. And I think technology today has a lot to offer. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We cannot wait 100 years until we domesticate new crops, new varieties, adapt them to tougher conditions or to new growing conditions. So life sciences have a lot to offer in that process, because crops need to be profitable for farmers. Crops need to yield in adequate amounts, and climate change is actually changing the equation very rapidly for farmers in terms of pests and diseases, making them more susceptible in regions where previously they were not present. So definitely CRISPR-Cas technology and all the incredible transformation that the biosciences is experiencing today needs to be brought to the equation. Another point regarding digital technology, we are seeing incredible contributions from the digital industry supporting finally the farmers. We have not um, enjoyed the luxury of the financial community being able to use computers and artificial intelligence to produce more efficiently. And finally, we're seeing spectral imaging, GPS technology, and even artificial intelligence coming to the table. And we need to approach it rapidly because time is of the essence. We are talking about 2030, the decade. This is the decade that we can make a difference. So, and we need to make a difference big time. So, I would like to emphasize, let's put dogmas aside and allow all the players to contribute in the same way that they have contributed positively to modern society.
Great, thanks, Hans, and thanks for highlighting the importance of profitability for farmers. And I wish we can also bring in to the discussion the smallholder farmers as well. So profitability is not just for bigger farmers as such, but there is issues of livelihood and rural development and gender issues, and for smallholder farmers who are responsible for most of the food that we eat. So let me bring in Emma around the myths on regenerative agriculture being less profitable, or what do you think? What's your views?
Yeah, well, this is interesting because over the past couple years, as I've been diving into this topic more deeply, and regenerative production has been surfacing higher and higher up in discussions, there's often a lot of debate and varying opinions and understandings around the profitability. Some people saying, well, we don't have it at scale today because it just won't work. It's going to be lower yields. It's just going to be worse for farmers. There's so much money that we need to mobilize to get there. So how do we start moving? And we get really stuck in the how. And interestingly, we did some analysis on 3 ingredients. So potatoes, wheat, and dairy in the EU and UK to understand if we apply a bundle of practices that support regenerative outcomes to each of those, what's the impact on yields? What's the transition period? And it does vary. For some ingredients like wheat, it's about 4 to 7 years. And what are the impacts on profitability? And we saw actually on average across those 3, it was an increase in profitability, very low margin, about $20 US per hectare per harvest, or annual in the case of dairy. But then coming back to the design piece, so if we go beyond just better sourcing of current ingredients and diversify what's actually on the farm, which also supports particularly the smallholders, but all farmers, when we're diversifying revenue streams and integrating crops that can actually be eaten by the farmers to support their and their families' livelihoods and health, nutrition. So if we take, for instance, wheat, and rather than intercropping with an inedible crop like clover, if we intercrop with green peas, and let's say, breakfast cereal company designs a product line that's using wheat and green peas, so they're driving the demand, which enables the farmer to make those planting decisions, then suddenly we increase the total food output across these 3 ingredients by about 50%. So increasing the total food output after the transition period, which again can vary, but it is still relatively shorter than many perceive, that is the game changer when it comes to the income and thus profitability. So we see that when you take that, what we call circular design for food approach, you increase profitability by about $3,100 per hectare per harvest, or in the case of dairy, which we did in a silvopasture system with walnuts integrated, it was per year. So it's just, again, these are 3 indicative examples. So it's not to be extrapolated and say that all crops have this and this is the exact numbers applied, but it does give us some good evidence points to rebuttal that myth and say, actually, no, this can work. But that's where the design piece and what ingredients and foods we're demanding by the industry and in the market, creating markets for, is so critical. And therefore, it lowers the bar and the barrier when it comes to finance. So we have less pressure on finance being the mechanism to help us get over that hump, the dip of yields and income, which of course we do need support mechanisms for.
Thanks very much, Emma. That's very clear, and thanks for explaining that. I want to see if anyone want to come in to say something about the importance of smallholder farmers. Otherwise, I'll ask Martin first if you want to expand on a question that was about the innovative approaches to address the issue we talked about earlier about food loss and waste. And food set for charities, and if these are scalable. You see the question in the screen there. Just your thought on that, particularly on the importance of innovation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can see a question there also around the legal framework, and I can maybe address these together. I mean, this is a great question. I mean, it's about actually setting the standards to make sure that you can't just share food that is past its sell-by date. Can't just share that with charities and food banks. That there needs to be some kind of regulation around that and standards. And it's interesting. There's Italy that has introduced something innovative, and it's all enshrined in law. And they have the GADA law that empower charities and food banks to become key actors in food surplus redistribution. They have a clear legal framework for that. So they've created a national regulatory framework for food donations. And that is important because it clarifies tax concession rules, for example, civil liabilities, the health and safety provisions, and all these kind of important things. And also, it really allows municipalities to award reductions in waste taxes for NGOs. So it's really important to have this kind of framework. And then there's also at a level, that is more kind of the social enterprise level. In Indonesia, there's a really interesting example that has seen shops join forces with the social enterprise, and that's called Garda Pangan, and they try to reduce food waste at the retail stage. So what they do is so firms with food approaching the expiry date, they basically, they pay the enterprise to distribute the produce to people in need through a food bank. And we interviewed actually the CEO of Garda Pangan for our report. And this organization guarantees the food will be consumed within a safe period, so removing the liability from the retail, for example. So that's really important, and that's why it's a great question. So that these standards need to be in place, and they can be applied at the national regulatory level, but they can also be applied by social enterprise.
Great, thanks, Martin. Let me come back to the question I mentioned earlier about smallholder farmers. So perhaps I'll bring you in, Hans. And Jose, feel free if you want to complement as well. Just a question around smallholder farmers, and you mentioned, Hans, earlier also the role of retailers and consumers. So perhaps you want to talk about smallholder farmers as well in that context.
Yeah, thank you, Situni. Definitely, all farmers are a huge part of this equation, small and large. There needs to be space for both of them, because each of them plays a significant role in conserving biodiversity, and especially in diversifying our food systems. And if you look at how consumers make their decisions at the supermarkets, really a few cents won't make the difference in their choices, but they make a huge difference in terms of the farmers that grow that food. And we cannot continue to put all the burden of revitalizing and transforming food systems on the farming side of the equation. And this is one of the reasons why Fresh Del Monte is partly farmer today. We did not divest from our farming operations, which source 45% of what we bring into the markets, because we need to understand what it means to be on that side of the equation. But on the other hand, until retailers and consumers play their part, the whole system will be stuck, and it's going to be difficult to move it. We need to bring it to the tipping point, and it doesn't really mean that much for the end consumer or for the retailer.
Yeah, thank you, Hans. And you highlighted in your first introduction the importance of involving everyone and the importance of collaboration. I wish we had time to talk about that, because the world is interconnected in that way. So we can't keep talking about things in isolation. Consumers, retailers, smallholder farmers, and others. There needs to be better connection in really dealing with the agri-food systems as a whole, the whole chain. All the issues we've been talking about, they have to be looked at in a synergistic way, as I mentioned in my introduction. I think we reaching the end of our event. I want to, before I bring in Jose, if you want to add something, I just want to let everyone know that after Jose, then I'll come back to you one after the other for one key message you want to leave the audience with. And please be brief about it. Just think about one important point that you want to convey. Jose, over to you.
Thank you. I try to be brief, complimenting Hans, that has been very perfect on his position. But from the financial perspective, alone, the smallholders, farmers will not be they will never face the better conditions of credit. They will never obtain good financial conditions. We need to foster their integration, whether through cooperativism, associativism, or integration through the supply chains in which they participate. Only with volume and good governance that we can provide better credit conditions suitable to this transition. So what we see when we engage a cooperative or a large association or transform a supply chain, spraying the investment on the smallholder farmers, we see a real result. Because when you sum up all of them, they are a large player in the market. So they can access, the leverage is on their side, it's not on the side of the financial sector. So we have to integrate, we have to sum up the small farmers in order for them to be competitive, accessing different credits. And just to one last point about the small farmers, they are the ones that are the basis of our food production, not including Brazil. We have large farms here, but what the real food production, the real innovation happens on the small farmer. So we have to foster this kind of integration to preserve this culture, to tell the small farmer, to tell the farmer in general, but mainly the smallholder, that they are not the villain, they are the protagonists of this change. They can't be the hero of the green transition. They can't be seen as an environmental villain. There are plenty of environmental villains out there, but definitely is not the small farmer.
Thank you. We had time to talk about innovation, and I wish we had time to talk about traditional and indigenous knowledge, because it is part of the innovation and it's long lasting as well. So thanks very much for that. So now we come to the end of the event. And as I said, let me ask each one of you, what is it that you want to leave the audience with? Emma?
Keep it short. That food brands and retailers have the power to make nature positive food the norm through the power of design.
Great, thanks. Martin?
Yeah, that's very short. I don't know whether it can be that short, but well done, Emma, on that. I think, I mean, if we look at the topic of regenerative agriculture, it can really only succeed if we, look at food systems kind of holistically. And I think that came through in our conversation. If we look at, we look at every kind of step of the system and how does it contribute to regeneration, supply chains, policy incentives, financing tools, and so on. Are they geared towards regeneration? And one important aspect that I would like to highlight, of course, I have mentioned the Food Sustainability Index before, is that we need, as the basis for the system approach, we need to be able to monitor and measure food system sustainability. And hopefully, we can make a contribution through that.
Great, thanks. Hans?
Thank you, Situni. Just want to invite the other players of the agriculture community to join this conversation. You will make the difference in reaching this important conversation, or bringing this important conversation to the tipping point.
Great, thanks, Hans. Jose?
I will wrap a powerful concept that Hans has repeated sometimes here in this conversation, dogma. Regenerative transition is not a question of dogma, it's a question of economic survival. So we have to engage it. In a polarized world such as we are, there is no space for discussing climate change as a conspiracy theory or regenerative transition as a question of choice. It's a question of survival.
Okay, thank you. Well, for me, is the need to change our mindset, look at things differently. So, excuse me, thank you all very much then, all the speakers, Emma, Hans, Martin, and Jose. And thanks to everyone who has been following us. I hope you found this helpful. There was so much to cover. There were so many really good points to make. That were made and gave us really a lot of food for thought. And let me also thank Zina and Pablo and the team. Apologies if I forgot some, for everyone who's been behind the scene in making this event happen. And to thank everyone in the World Climate Foundation. And please stay connected with us as we tackle part 2 and part 3. So part 2 on the 14th of October and part 3 on the 10th of November at COP26. So thank you again very much. And I wish you a good day, good evening, depending when you are. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.